Twisted Metal really shouldn't be as much fun as it is. The show's 10 half-hour episodes arrived on Peacock at the end of July, starring Anthony Mackie and Stephanie Beatrix in an extremely loose adaptation of the source video game. Of course, we say extremely loose, as if it would have been possible to adapt a turn-of-the-millennium series of vehicular combat games, the last of which was released more than a decade ago, into a perfectly faithful television show. Indeed, Twisted Metal gets at one of the interesting challenges of the modern intellectual property era, where recognizable names and brands have real currency across different media. How do you adapt something across two radically different mediums? It is notoriously tough to adapt video games into film and television. Indeed, the last time that we covered a video game adaptation with The Last of Us, we included an extended joke listing all of the terrible, terrible cinematic adaptations of video games. We're not going to do that again. However, it seems fairly uncontroversial to concede that it is difficult to adapt video games into other media. There's a reason for this. Video games are a truly immersive art form. They're experienced not only through sound and vision like film or television, but through the experience of actually playing. In narrative games, to pick an obvious example, the user's decisions can impact and shape the story.
You're working too hard.
However, it's more than that. It's experiential. Consider the Alien franchise. Watching the movies, there are moments of horror and discomfort. The audience is unsettled by what they see and hear, and sometimes by what they don't see. There are moments of rising dread and horrific release, but those are completely controlled by the creative team. The director, the writer, the editor, the cinematographer, and countless others all put those scary moments together. Playing a video game, the player is not just a passive observer of the action, but an active participant in it. Playing an Alien video game, for example, that sense of dread and terror escalates based on the choices and decisions that the player makes, which affects what play out on screen. Historically, narratives have tended to be important in film and television because they provide a structure and a logic to guide the audience through the experience. In contrast, video games give the player more control to shape their own experience, and so the story is less important than the feeling in the moment. Games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter have dense internal mythologies that matter deeply to hardcore fans, but for most players, it's the experience itself that attracts them to the game. That is something ineffable, and it's hard to replicate without putting a controller in the audience's hand. This is one reason why video game adaptations have historically proven difficult for Hollywood. It's like trying to translate two languages with two very different sets of grammar. Of course, the exception here is The Last of Us, which is a hugely successful adaptation of the video game that is incredibly faithful to the source material. However, The Last of Us is something of a special case. It's a video game that is very cinematic in its storytelling, to the point that the game's opening sequence, in which the player controls a character in the backseat of a car as the world ends around them, feels like a fairly overt homage to the iconic long take from Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men. As such, The Last of Us is a game that lends itself to a literal and narrative-focused adaptation. However, not all video games are going to lend themselves to this approach. In fact, many of the most successful video games, such as platformers like Super Mario Bros. Sonic the Hedgehog, are popular precisely because they aren't narrative heavy. The player picks up the controller and, no matter what the individual game or level, is immediately immersed in the sensation of playing. This is actively a problem with many of the worst video game adaptations, which spend more time trying to make sense of these inherently absurd virtual worlds than they do recreating the sensation of being immersed in them. There are plenty of reasons why Illumination's recent Super Mario Bros. Movie has been more successful than the early 90s adaptation, but one of them is that it doesn't feel burdened by having to explain, why is Goombas?
Goomba! Yeah. Walk tall!
It can just have fun with Goombas. There are similar problems with adaptations like Assassin's Creed, which spends more time explaining the mechanics and internal logic of its world than it does actually assassinating. This is why many of the more successful video game adaptations effectively outsource the application of conventional cinematic narrative logic, rather than trying to retrofit the internal mythology of the source material. Paul W.S. Anderson's Mortal Kombat understands that the audience wants to see cool fights, and so focuses on those, taking its plot structure directly from classic martial arts movies like Enter the Dragon. In contrast, the sequel, Annihilation, goes all in on fan service and lore, and the result is bad. Very bad. Similarly, Pokemon Detective Pikachu takes its familiar intellectual property and weds it to a story that combines both Chinatown and Get Out. But, you know, for kids. By importing the basic narrative structure from other films and similar genres, Detective Pikachu can then concentrate on the part of the concept that people would actually want to see. cool Pokemon doing cool Pokemon stuff. Twisted Metal does something similar. Notably, the core premise of the game, a tournament of vehicular combat, is only teased as the season-ending cliffhanger. It's a hook for a second season that, if streaming has taught us anything, is absolutely certain to happen. Instead, the season borrows from a variety of different sources that make sense given the loosest framing of the game's premise. There's a lot of Mad Max Fury Road in here, for example, which makes sense if you're making a post-apocalyptic car movie. The show's concept was derived from a pitch by Reet Reese and Paul Wernick, who wrote the movie Zombieland. All of that carries over into the actual plot of Twisted Metal, which is a comedy about two characters sparking an unlikely relationship at the end of the world. It's something that Reese and Wernick have done before, but it's a reliable enough template. By applying a set of basic narrative and character dynamics that have been demonstrated to work, Twisted Metal then has the freedom to have some fun at the margins. It can concentrate on attempting to capture the iconography and the texture of the source material, unburdened by having to worry about a set of dynamics that were largely irrelevant to many of the casual players of the original game. So, Twisted Metal imports character and car designs wholesale. It features impressive action set pieces on a streaming budget. More than that, though, it understands that part of the lore of a Twisted Metal television show is capturing the ineffable feeling of playing Twisted Metal. It's more than just vehicular carnage, it's something more profound, something more emotional. Twisted Metal doesn't just take the viewer back to the game, it takes them back to the time of the game. The show is saturated with 90s nostalgia, most obviously in a soundtrack that includes everything from Hanson to Cisco.
Do you love the silver-haired god? Then don't lie to me.
It's strange to think that Twisted Metal is somehow the biggest piece of pop culture this July to feature the original unremixed Aqua version of Barbie Girl. Set against the backdrop of a world that ended in 2002, the show includes affectionate homages to everything from Blankman to Master of Disguise. It even includes a recurring role for 90s icon Neve Campbell. The goal is clearly not just to immerse the audience in the specifics of Twisted Metal, but also in the larger cultural context of the original franchise, which was rooted very firmly in the 1990s. It's an interesting approach to the question of adaptation, but one that is remarkably well suited to adapting video games to screen. It's a philosophy that isn't particularly fixated on continuity or minutia, but instead on capturing or simulating what it might have been like to play the game during the 1990s and early 2000s. It prioritizes the intangible and ineffable experience of the source material ahead of simple literalism. And it's the better for that. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.